to the Fretboard Journal podcast. I'm your host, Jason Verlinde. As always, that's John Rauhaus playing in the background. I am happy to present to you the most banjo-filled conversation I've shared probably in at least a year on the Fretboard Journal podcast, but I'm also happy to say you do not need to be a banjo player to appreciate the conversation you are about to hear. Tony Trischka, one of the greatest banjo players of all time, has just released a record called Earl Jam, and we talk all about it. And the story behind this record is so out there and amazing. I think you're going to love it. Basically, Tony received a thumb drive, a USB drive, with a bunch of never before heard outtakes and home recordings of Earl Scruggs done by John Hartford. He decided to do what I guess no mere mortal would do, transcribe these solos note for note, and then turn them into a record, the record Earl Jam. He invited a bunch of very amazing, talented friends onto the record, folks like Billy Strings and Molly Tuttle and Brittany Haas and Daryl Langer and Ronnie McCurry. And he created this incredible record out of basically these fragments that he heard on this USB drive. It's a totally cool idea that only Tony could pull off, and there is so much to learn from this conversation, even if you never touch a 5-string banjo. I think everybody out there will love it. Let me know. Shoot me a note, podcast@fretboardjournal.com. Let me know what you think. Also, go on to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review over there if you haven't yet. Sit back, enjoy the conversation. Tony's one of the most fascinating, brilliant minds in music. You will love it. Speaking of fascinating people in the world of music, I've gathered about, 100 of them for this year's Fretboard Summit, and I would love to see you at it. This year's Fretboard Summit takes place August 23rd to 25th in Chicago at the Old Town School of Folk Music. I just posted a first-timer's guide to the Fretboard Summit on fretboardjournal.com. I will include a link in the show notes. It kind of walks you through the entire experience because the Fretboard Summit is not really a music camp. It's not really a guitar festival. It's sort of an amalgamation of all these cool things and TED Talks and maybe just the greatest dinner party ever. And I want you all to come, and I want you to wrap your head around an event that is totally different than probably what you expect, but also has a lot of familiar faces, especially if you've read the Fretboard Journal or listened to this podcast. Again, all the fun takes place August 23rd to 25th at the Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago. Drop me a line if you have any questions. The other big announcement around here is that our 54th issue is now mailing. And if you love bluegrass music, I should tell you, Peter Rowan is in this issue. Cameron Noller did an incredible story on Peter. And there are just a ton of great features and photo essays and interesting things. We really are having fun with print. This is not just a rehash of guitar stories you've read for the last 20 or 30 years. We're trying to spotlight a different side of guitar culture in every issue of the Fretboard Journal. I often talk about our sponsors on this podcast, and I bet a bunch of you think that Mike and Mike's Guitar Bar, our first sponsor, are primarily an electric guitar dealer. And yes, they do have, hundreds of electric guitars at any one point. But I should remind you all that they have a bunch of great bluegrass instruments, including a 37 D18 right now from Martin, a 1941 Gibson J35, and dozens of other great flat top guitars. So if anybody out there wants to hit up one of the coolest guitar stores you'll ever talk to, go to mmguitarbar.com or follow them on Instagram and let them know the Fretboard Journal sent you. Also on the bluegrass front, and including in the banjo world, our friends at Peghead Nation are offering you your first month free or $20 off of an annual subscription with the discount code FRETBOARD. And they've got a whole bunch of great banjo classes, including some taught by Bill Evans and Wes Corbett and various others. I am personally a student at Peghead Nation, and you should be too. Again, go to pegheadnation.com. Tell them the Fretboard Journal sent you. Isotope, our favorite little software plugin for fixing all sorts of audio glitches, has just launched RX11, and you can get 10% off your order with the discount code FRET10. StewMac is sponsoring the podcast once again. They just released probably one of the coolest items I've seen in the StewMac catalog for a while. Dan Erlewine, Lutherie legend, has autographed a whole bunch of his book, which is basically a Bible for anyone who wants to work on their guitar. I'll include a link in the show notes. And then last but not least, they don't offer banjo strings, but our friends at Stringjoy Strings are offering you 10% off your first order with the promo code FRETBOARD. they do have mandolin strings now, as well as acoustic guitar strings and electric guitar strings. And by all accounts, especially the accounts of many of you all Fretboard Journal podcast listeners, everybody's loving their Stringjoy order lately. So thank you. Keep those comments coming. And again, the conversation you're about to hear is with the one and only Tony Trischka, and the record we're talking about is called Earl Jam. It's the first of 2 installments of this wild project that he's been working on. And I think anyone out there who loves music, who loves history, who loves transcribing is going to appreciate some of the stuff that Tony tells us. I hope you like it. Here is my conversation with banjo legend Tony Trischka.
Jason.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm realizing we could have done this at Wintergrass.
Let's go back.
I don't know that I have the energy to go back.
Those, 4.5, 5 hour flights are just, especially because I had the middle seat on the way home. Oh boy. Let's stick with what we're doing.
Okay. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excellent. Yeah.
Good. It's been a while.
Wintergrass.
Yeah, it was amazing. I was wiped out. I'm getting old, I guess. There we all are.
Oh, you don't know the meaning of the word old. I got you beat by a country mile.
Yeah, do you participate as a Wintergrass headliner? Do you participate in the jams that go on till 3 a.m. or do you kind of check out?
I checked out this time. I was really busy catching up with a lot of friends from out there. I used to go out Bellingham and Seattle and Vancouver, like in the later 70s into the 80s. And there were a bunch of folks I hadn't seen in a long time. So I spent a lot of time catching up with them. When I first arrived on Wednesday night, Michael Daves, we played together, and he happened to be right there in the lobby looking for a jam session. And he said he couldn't find any. So we just opened up our cases right by where the merch table was and just started jamming for about half an hour. And that was the only jam I got involved in.
It's such a beautiful thing going to a bluegrass festival and seeing those things kind of unfold.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, no, I was just so busy spending time with friends, I didn't get a chance to get into the jam. So I love getting into the jam sessions. It's just this particular time it didn't work out that way, except for that first one.
Well, talk to me about this forthcoming record, because I read the bio and I listened to it, and apparently there's a thumbnail drive with all these rare recordings. I have no idea where that came from, though.
Well, okay, so there's so much to talk about, but it came from a gentleman named Bob Pekel, who's an acquaintance of mine from Syracuse, where I grew up, and he happened to be at some of these jam sessions with John Hartford. Okay, so the thumb drive is a thumb drive of over 200 songs that were recorded at jam sessions taking place roughly between the mid-1980s and the mid-1990s. So over a 10-year period, roughly. This is what I've been told. Mostly at Earl Scruggs' house. And sometimes it was just the two of them jamming. Sometimes there'd be others, you listen to it and you can hear Tony Rice in there. Sometimes you can hear Del McCurry, sometimes Mac Wiseman, sometimes just Earl and John with the bass player. Anyway, this guy, Bob Pekel, happened to be at some of these jam sessions. And at some point, John Hartford called him and said, look, sometime, if my house burns down, all these tapes, all these recordings will be lost. So I'd like to have them in at least one other place. So he sent apparently copies of all these cassettes. John recorded everything with just a small little cassette machine. And anyway, so we sent the copies to Bob Pekel in Syracuse, who many years later digitized them. And he and I were working on an Earl Scruggs book project. And every once in a while, he would just send me a song, one of these jam session tunes. And I'd go, what's this from? And finally, after doing this a few times, he said, all right, I'm going to send you a thumb drive of all of it, all that he has. And that's how I came upon it. And it was just an eye-opener because I started listening to Earl Scruggs when I was 14 years old, around 1963, and just fell in love with his music, of course, which is why I became obsessed with the banjo, and I'm still obsessed with the banjo. And after all these years and having transcribed many of his recordings, whatever tunes that are readily available, I thought, well, I've got a pretty good handle on this Scruggs thing, I said smugly to myself. And then suddenly I get these recordings, and he's doing tunes we've never heard him do before, like Gentle on My Mind and Lady Madonna and Amazing Grace and Chinese Breakdown. And I start listening to these tunes and hearing things that I've never heard him do before, not just the tunes, but techniques and subtle little twists and turns and just some great syncopations. And it just, pardon the 60s expression, blew my mind. And then I started listening to songs that I knew well by him, like Cripple Creek, for instance, or Home Sweet Home. And taking Cripple Creek, for instance, and some of these tunes would have 5 or 6 versions, that he had played at different jam sessions at different times. These were all arranged alphabetically. And anyway, after listening to 3 or 4 versions of Cripple Creek, well, this is, it sounds great, but it's not a lot different than what he did on the original recording on Foggy Mountain Banjo. And then, like, maybe it was the 5th version of it, suddenly he's doing these blues licks in Cripple Creek, which you're not supposed to do. It's not supposed to happen. And just many other things that I would have to play for you to, properly express. So it's just really, really exciting. And so I decided, once I started transcribing these, and I've recorded about 35 or 40 of these tunes or different versions of the same tune, I decided, well, a lot of this, probably this will never see the light of day. And if that is the case, I want to record these tunes so other people can at least hear what Earl did. So I recorded 25 tunes, 15 of which will be on the new album. And basically every single note I'm playing is a solo, in the solos, not the backup, but the solos are note for note what Earl played in these jam sessions. There's nothing of my stuff in there. It's all Earl. And I've, of course, expanded these tunes to full band situations. And Billy Strings is on there, and Molly Tuttle, and Vince Gill, and Sierra Farrell, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, plus many other folks, Sam Bush is on there, et cetera, et cetera. So, and you've heard it. So,
yeah. When you got this USB drive, were there I mean, you said like Tony's on a few of these tracks, Mac Wiseman, were there notes saying who was on it, or was it just like, here's 200 songs, figure it out?
Figure it out, basically, is what it was. So, but, I know Tony's voice, and you can hear him talking, and then he plays, and yeah, that's Tony. So, just from this many years on the bluegrass planet, I know who these folks are.
And what is your technique when? I mean, I'll be honest. I listen to way more banjo music than most people, but probably not as much as a real serious banjo player does. But the thought of transcribing banjo music seems incredibly daunting to me. And then you're saying John Hartford's also on these original tracks, so that you're picking apart one banjo part. Like, how do you do it?
Well, to be clear, John Hartford's playing fiddle on everything.
Oh, he is. Okay.
He's playing fiddle, yeah. Although there's at least one tune where Earl's playing a low-tuned banjo, which I'm assuming is John's banjo.
Oh, okay.
Cool to hear him doing that. Well, I've been transcribing banjo music since 1970 and probably earlier.
Sure.
So I slow things down to half speed. And again, I've done it so many times, I have a pretty good sense. Although there are times with some of these where I can hear that Earl's doing something amazing. The recording quality is not always great. Like sometimes a lot of what John would be doing would be he'd be strumming the fiddle to create this great rhythm, and Earl would be playing. And I can tell, like, John, move away from the mic. He's like so close to the mic that he's sort of obliterating what Earl's playing. And it's like, oh. But so, I mean, there's certain things where I really wanted to transcribe it, but I could tell I'm just not going to be able to hear it because the mic, or the cassette machine's not close enough to Earl to hear what he's doing. But just slow things down to half speed. And I just listened, for instance, not to get really geeky about it, but I listened to the first string, and by hearing what the first string is doing, and sometimes the fifth string, I can tell what kind of a roll he's using. If he's using, a finger pattern, if he's using a forward roll or a backward roll or alternating thumb roll, et cetera, et cetera. So, and so I tried to choose the tunes where it was, where it was really clear what he was playing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It still seems overwhelming to me, but that's me.
Well, there's certain things that people love to do. Like my wife is great at figuring out she's my travel agent, and she loves digging into points for airfares and hotels. And I hate that, but she does like that. And I love transcribing banjo music. It's like a puzzle to me, just getting deep inside what were these people doing? My heroes, what were they doing? So
you 200, you had 200 tracks on this USB drive. It sounds like there were multiple takes of many songs. So how many different songs in their entirety were kind of on these, on this original artifact?
I don't honestly know. I haven't counted it all to figure out how many. I'd say at least 100, probably more. That's a guess, but it's a lot of different stuff. Some of which we've heard him do before, but other things not at all.
Yeah. And you really wanted to focus on the really interesting ones.
Yeah, either really interesting because we've never heard them do like Freight Train Blues, which is something Bob Dylan recorded on his first album. But I went to an earlier source, found a version by Roy Acuff from 1936 or 37. And Earl he doesn't do a ton of stuff, but what he does is like really cool. He does sort of this Jimmy Rogers kind of yodely thing on the banjo. And I got Michael Cleveland to play on that. And there's a harmonica player on the original version whose nickname was Dynamite. And he's blowing his brains out in a good way, musically speaking, and it sounds amazing. And I sent it to Michael Cleveland so he could, hear the original version. And Michael sort of took that craziness in this harmonica solo, and did it on the fiddle, triple fiddles, I might add. Michael's just beyond. So it was really crazy, the stuff that he played on there. I was just thinking about it this morning. I've sort of gone full circle because I started with Scruggs, really being and have always been really into his music, but coming around here at the end after doing a bunch of recordings with some really weird stuff earlier in my career, and just trying all these different things in here. In the sunset of my years, no, much later on, I returned to Earl in a really big way. And his playing on these recordings is wonderful, and they're he's playing in some cases, I think in his 70s, certainly 60s and 70s, and he's playing really fast, and one thing that can go when you get older is your speed, just so you just kind of slow down a little bit, but he's burning fast and his timing is great. And one thing that's a little bit different is that whereas, most of the recordings we know by him, his playing is, I hate to use a term machine gun, but it's just so every note the same value, really strong, pushing, which is the beauty of his playing for a lot of his career. But here in these later recordings, in some cases he has more dynamic range. You can hear him kind of playing a little more softly and then a little louder, and it kind of goes in a wave almost, which is a much different approach than we'd heard earlier in his playing.
Yeah. You mentioned sending to Michael the original track. Is that what you did with all of the guests on this album? Yeah,
I think the original, either going back to 1936 or whatever, or just sending recordings of the jam that for that particular tune, so they could hear what they were doing. And this first single came out of Brown's Ferry Blues with Billy Strings. And I'd heard Earl play that before backstage out in Missouri. I was out there doing some work and went to the show, and Earl I produced Steve Martin's second album of recent years, a second banjo album called Rare Bird Alert. So I was out there doing some pre-recording stuff with him, and Earl was opening up. So at one point I was backstage, and Earl's road manager said, "Would you like to see the banjo?" Meaning the banjo that Earl recorded everything with. And I went, "Yes, please." So I went to Earl's dressing room, and I played a little bit of ground speed on it, which was a tune that Earl recorded on that very banjo, which was pretty exciting. And I handed the banjo and Steve Martin was backstage also. I handed the banjo to Steve, and he plays a lot in double C tuning, which is not the standard bluegrass tuning, and played a tune that he had written. And then Steve hands the banjo to Earl, and Earl, without batting an eyelash, starts playing Brown's Ferry Blues in double C tuning, which is a tuning I'd never heard him play in before. And it was like, let me get my phone out. I want to record this. But he just played it once too and it was gone. But I kind of remember what he did. So I can still replicate that. But on this recording, he does it in a completely different tuning, just standard G tuning, which is what most bluegrass, that's the bluegrass tuning for the banjo.
Yeah.
So it just like, wow, he did that in these two completely different tunings and was comfortable with it. It's just, the deeper you go, the deeper I find his music is. And I thought it was really deep to begin with, but it's even deeper than I had any idea of knowing. So.
Was that the only time you've held his banjo and played it?
Yeah, I think that was the one time. That was it.
How did you decide who was going to be a special guest on this album?
Wow. It was sort of I would do one or two or three tunes at a time rather than going in, okay, I'm going to knock this out in a week. So I'd sat in with Billy Strings a couple of times and had a chance to play with him on Bela's My Bluegrass Heart album, one tune. And, he's amazing. And, not just because he's famous, but just because he's such a great musician and a really sweet guy. And he doesn't, so many people sound like Tony Rice, and I wanted something that had, just was uniquely him. And that's and plus he could play outside, not outside in the yard, but he can take it out and, play these weird notes, which really appeals to me, which he didn't on this album. But, anyway, so he's just such a monster on the guitar and such a great singer. So that's why I chose him. And we did two songs with him, Brown's Ferry Blues, which will be on this album, and Gentle on My Mind, which will be on the second album. And Molly Tuttle, I've known since she was a teenager. I did this. Should I just keep blathering? Do you have time?
Keep blathering, please. Yes.
I'll blather on. So I did this workshop. A woman named Tashina Claridge and her brother had this workshop. I still have a workshop out called the Shasta Camp near Mount Shasta out in Northern California. So I did that one year, and I didn't know what to expect. It's very loosely organized, but it's a great time. Mostly younger players, kids in their teens and somewhat older, but. So, okay, here I am, a banjo teacher. Where are the banjo students? Oh, well, you only have one banjo student. Oh, okay. So I go to teach this one band. I was teaching cello players as well. Don't ask me how that worked out, but I figured it out.
Sure.
But I had one lesson with one banjo student. And so it was a young lady who was a really good Scruggs player, but it wasn't just me. There were two other banjo teachers. So three of us banjo teachers taught this one young lady.
That's a good teacher to student ratio.
A pretty good, exactly. That's what I want to say. So she was great. She was really good, and we, gave her our ideas, whatever. And it was Molly Tuttle, who was there as a banjo player, and that's all I knew that she played. And then I teach somewhat sometimes at the Berklee College of Music, and I taught her there some. And plus, I used her on. I do a Christmas show every year, and I used her for a couple of years for the Christmas show, and recorded an album actually live at Lee Von Helm's studio in Woodstock, or his barn in Woodstock, and she's on that recording. So anyway, I've known Molly for a long time, so that's why I wanted to have her on there, because again, great guitar player, great singer, wonderful person. It was sort of a no-brainer. And I don't know, I could go through a whole bunch of folks. Sam Bush I've known since the very first Bluegrass Festival in 1965. We were both there, and he was this 16 or 17-year-old kid playing fiddle in a field, just playing fiddle tunes by himself. And this is the first time I saw Sam Bush, and we've known each other ever since and been friendly with Newgrass and et cetera, et cetera. And then Vince Gill's on there. That was a suggestion of Ken Irwin, who's running, he's one of the three people that started Down the Road Records, the label that I'm on. These are the three original Rounder Records folks that after all these years, they sold Rounder, and now they're going back to the way Rounder originally was. And I guess my release is the first one. Anyway, Ken had suggested Vince Gill, and I said, well, sure. I've met him a couple of times over the years, and he agreed to do it and was very generous and sang Bury Me Beneath the Willow from the jam sessions, and just was wonderful. I found something out about Nashville time. In other words, the session was for 11 o'clock, and I figured I'll get there 15 minutes early, and Vince was already sitting there. So
it's like the opposite of island time. People show up early.
Exactly. You got to show up half an hour early. I've done so ever since. So Vince taught me that, and he's like the sweetest guy and really fun and relaxed and just the greatest. So, and of course, sang incredibly. So that's those are a few of the folks that are on there and how we got them to be on there. And just incredible fiddlers. I've got Stuart Duncan's on a few tunes, and Brittany Haas, who you may have seen out there in Seattle, who's just monstrous. It's the greatest joyous vibe on stage, and on and on and on. So anyway, those are Del McCurry. How could I forget Del McCurry? And I've also known Del since the, kind of mid to late 70s, and saw him in 1963 playing with Bill Monroe at the Newport Folk Festival when I was 14 years old, with Bill Keith on banjo. So I go way back with a bunch of these folks. And Del agreed he's on 3 songs, 2 songs on this upcoming album, 1 on the second album. And it was with a full band, and it was just sort of like getting into a warm bath playing with them. The groove is just so deep and so, I don't want to say relaxed because it drives. It's got drive and it's got the edge, but it's so comfortable, and it's so, again, the groove is so deep because these are, it's Ronnie and it's, Jason Carter and their bass player. And they've been playing together for years. So you just walk into this thing. It's like, oh, yes. And, this past January 6th, would have been Earl's 100th birthday. There was a big concert at the Ryman that I was invited to join in on. Jerry Douglas was hosting it, and so I wanted to play with Del with his band for the 2 tunes I was going to play at the concert that night. And so rehearsal was 10 o'clock. My slot was at 10 o'clock in the morning. So there I am at 10 o'clock in the morning with Del and the band. And I was saying, this is a great way to start the day, jamming with Del and the boys. So it's been a good year so far. That's what I'll say.
Yeah. So you just rattled off a half dozen of the top tier Nashville musicians. Obviously, you didn't record this all in 1 week long. I mean, people are touring, right? Like you had to do this over the course of a long period of time.
Yeah, I'll have to sit down and figure out how long it was. That's what I was saying. I would record almost, not everything, but almost everything was recorded in Nashville. A few things up here in New York with the Gibson brothers. And my friend Bruce Malsky, do a couple of tunes with him also. Incredible fiddler, guitar player, banjo player, and beyond. But yeah, I'd go down and record 2 or 3 tunes with the Billy Molly sessions. I did 2 songs with Billy on a Saturday and 2 with Molly on a Sunday, I believe it was, but back to back on 2 days, and used most of the same band. Michael Cleveland on the first day, and Bela produced the Billy session, which was great. And he suggested that band with Sam and Michael and Mark Schatz on bass. and it was just beyond fun. And Bela's sitting there behind the board, and we finished recording it, and I said, "Man, you got to take a solo on this," and he did, and it's mind blowing. It's just, geez, just knock it out of the ballpark. And so it was really fun having him do that. And I meant to mention this before, and the jam version, with John and Earl of Browns Ferry Blues. At the end towards the end, John forgets the lyrics. And so instead of singing the lyrics, he sings, so here we are, and here we are, and here we are, and here we are. And then he lists whoever's in the mission. And I didn't know he was going to do that. Billy gets into the here we are, and here we are, and then there's Tony and Sam and Bela, and he lists everyone in that session. He just copied what John Hartford had done and replicated it for this recording, which I thought was really cool to do that.
Yeah,
because John just forgot the lyrics. They're just jam. He forgot the lyrics. So
yeah, John was good with that kind of spoken word thing.
Yeah. It's just a joy to have all these. And one of the tunes, I'm going down the alphabetical list, and they did that. They do "Here Comes the Bride." That's one of the tunes that they do on there, and Earl just plays the straight melody, and John kicks it off. It's just the two of them, and he's playing it like a fiddle tune. What fiddle tune is this? I don't know this. And in the midst of all that, John is dancing. He's doing his buck and wing, or whatever you would call that dance that he would do on the plywood board. And he's just at Earl's house, just the two of them. And it's not like he's doing a show for anyone, but he just felt like dancing. So he starts dancing. And we replicate that. That'll be on the second album.
When does the second album come out?
The Bride and Mark Schatz, who a year after the first one. So roughly. So the first album's coming out this June 7th, and then it'll be a year after that. Roughly speaking. Yeah, that's the plan.
So are we really indebted to John Hartford for pushing Earl to do these sort of unique covers and songs? Or do you think it was kind of a mutual, they were both coming up with this material? I mean, Here Comes the Bride, like that seems like a unlikely choice to just bust out at a jam.
I know, really they did that? Yeah, I think, from what I understand, like Earl was kind of off the scene. I mean, he much later in his life, he sort of went back to touring some. I got to see him in New York City a couple of times with his son Gary and the rest of the band. But I think he was kind of off the scene, with maybe some health issues and whatnot. And as I understand it, John would sort of, hey, Earl, let's jam. Let's get together and do some playing. And as my understanding, it was more John's impetus to kind of get Earl back to playing again. Shoot, I was going to say something really profound, but I can't remember.
About Here Comes the Bride.
And it related to that. But as I say, Earl just sounded great. Oh, yeah, this is what I was going to say. You listen to these recordings, and it's not like Earl's stumbling through things. John said, hey, let's do this. And maybe Earl doesn't know it that well. You don't hear him stumbling. He nails a place where he seemed comfortable. And it just was amazing that just tune after tune after tune after tune. San Antonio Rose. Is that a standard one tune for him? And he just takes a beautiful solo on it, mostly playing just the simple melody, but he put some rolls in there, and that's on the album also. Because it was so unusual that he would do that. And I thought, let's get this on there. But he nails it. And as you get everything. And I have to imagine a lot of those were John's suggestion, not just Earl's. And I don't imagine, okay, before we record this jam, let's sit down and play it for 5 minutes so you have it in your fingers. I think they just did it, and he just could do it. I don't know. It defies logic in some ways.
Did you ever find yourself in a jam with John Hartford where he was throwing curveballs at you?
No, I never was, because I live up here and I never happened to be down south. I never happened to be in Nashville when those jams occurred. So I was never at one of those jam sessions. Yeah, I wouldn't be that comfortable with some of these tunes if they threw them at me. I know a lot of them, but okay, now you take a solo. Okay, this is going to suck, but or hopefully not. But to have such well figured out tunes, arrangements of these tunes that are all played, they're just new classics that no one's heard. So yeah, he just nailed them one after the other, and didn't like lose time or anything. He was just like, he'd been playing them for years. And I can't imagine he'd been playing Here Comes the Bride for a long time. He just sort of could do it.
Sure.
So it's pretty remarkable.
So you made these note for note transcriptions. What did you think of when you decided what banjo to use on this recording?
Basically, I'm just using this guy here, which is just my main banjo. That's the main one I use. But I have this pre-war Gibson Master Tone, at least the pot is pre-war, from 1932, and I used that on some of the New York recordings. So I used the two banjos.
Okay. The first one, is that your Deering?
That's my Deering. Yeah, it's my signature model called Golden Clipper, and that's the one I'm using on that.
Got it.
Should I describe it a little bit to you?
Yeah, please do. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, well, my background is Czech, and so I wanted the inlay pattern to be based on the artwork of Alphonse Mucha, M-U-C-H-A, who was this Czech artist. Anyway, I'm spacing the name style of art. Anyway, Art Nouveau. Anyway, he was an artist from the late 1800s into the 1930s and had to flee when Hitler came and took over Czechoslovakia. But anyway, so I had put together are based on his artwork, and the material, which I thought, well, I'll have just pearl, white inlay. And then as I was leaving San Diego, the factory there, the Deering factory, I discussed what I wanted, and they said, or you could have this material, and they held up this square of something called Dichrolam, which I think is Dychrolam. I have to look it up, and it's this kind of chemical with metal flakes thing, which really pops in the sun, and it's pretty cool. And then I wanted an arched fingerboard just because it's more comfortable for my fingers, and I like it. And it has a slightly wider neck than the Master Tone, and it has these what did we call them? These brackets, tone enhancer brackets, which, like most brackets, are straight, but right by the neck, they follow the contour of the neck. So it's the tone enhancer bracket. When people ask about it, which is actually BS because it probably doesn't do anything. But
I was going to ask, am I supposed to fall for this?
No, I'm not trying to pull the wool over your eyes, Jason. But I spoke to this woman who was a physicist. My father was a physicist, but he's gone, so I couldn't ask him. But I asked her, okay, so this bracket does this. Would this actually enhance the tone? And she said, probably, because it's curved like that. It has a little more mass, and it probably would enhance the tone. So maybe it's not BS after all. Okay. But anyway, and then this is quilted maple in the resonator, which is this really highly figured maple. And a friend of mine, Tom Ellis, who's a luthier in Austin, who I've known for years, and I was at IBMA with him one year, or I ran into him there, and he said, hey, you have to see this mandolin I just made for Ricky Skaggs. And he shows me the back of it, and it was made of this quilted maple. Yeah. And someday I'm going to have a resonator of quilted maple. So I finally got my wish with this. And then they added abalone, which I didn't ask them to do. They just know. So it's very blinged out, and it's gold plated. So, do you play better with a blinged out banjo? Is that a known fact? Much better. Oh yeah. Okay. The more gold plating, the more bling you have, it makes you play better. Okay, not. I can pretend that it does. No, it's just to be, it's conspicuous consumption. So when people are like, this guy's got a lot of money for a banjo player. He can afford something like this. Yeah, that's what it is. It's just trying to show off my pecuniary excellence or something.
You were in our 11th issue, I think, a long time ago, and there were several Are there still many banjos in your life? I think that we saw. I think there was a gourd banjo picture, if I remember. Oh yeah, you're panning to a closet full of cases.
Yes, yeah. And I've got a gourd banjo up there on the wall. I've got two. This is one. This was one made by a guy named Scott Didlake, who was the first person to make these. So this was, I met him in 1988, I think, at this Tennessee Banjo. It's kind of lost a little bit there, but it's really cool. He wanted to pay tribute to all the instruments and were buried in unmarked graves. Boards they would have used in Africa and what kind of wood they would use for the neck, et cetera, et cetera. So, and they did an album, the one before this one's called Shall We Hope, which is, I came up with a story about made up a story about the Civil War, and happened to go to an enslaved graveyard outside of Asheville, and there were just stones. There were 1,900 people buried there, apparently. I knew this guy was a history professor at Warren Wilson College there, and I'm getting off track here, but just since we're talking about it, and he said that his class was sort of clearing the underbrush from this enslaved graveyard, and I went out there and looked at it, and there was just stones where someone was buried with no. This was before the end of the Civil War, but the gravedigger was enslaved, and they would be buried in a wicker basket, and then just a stone where the person was buried, and that was it. Unmarked graves. That's how it was. So anyway, Scott Didlake was trying to pay tribute to all those people who will never know, but who played this instrument.
Yeah,
this kind of instrument. So
yeah. And you have quite a collection there.
Yep.
The other Gibson, the Gibson that you played on the recording. Tell us about that.
It's something I got in the late '80s. I was at our band Skyline was opening up for the Osborne Brothers in Troy, New York, and Sonny had just recently gotten this pre-war Granada Gibson Mastertone, and I remember after they did their sound check, he was just standing in a corner playing Cumberland Gap Jim, some straight ahead tune, and killing it because he was Sonny. It sounded so amazing. And he was just getting off on the sound of the banjo because he was playing into the corner, so the sound would come back at him. And it was like, God, this guy he's been playing for all these years and he's still in love with the banjo. I love that. And then we started talking, and he said, you need one of these things because, if you're a carpenter, you need the best tools. You're a banjo player, you need the best banjo. So I'm going to find you a pre-war Mastertone. And he did. I don't know, a year later or 6 months later, he gave me a call and said, hey, I've got a banjo for you. And I met him at a festival and went on to the bus, and Little Roy Lewis was there, and I tried it out, and okay. And it cost a lot less then than it does now. So I got on the ground floor. Well, the ground floor would have been the 1930s, but
short of that, yes.
Short of that, yeah. I wasn't there back then. So, and it's got a great, great sound, needless to say. So that's another one of my main squeezes. I don't take it out because it's, I don't want to travel with it and risk something happening, but I play it at home, and once in a while, and I recorded with it on a couple of tracks and Brothers, like I said.
Now at Wintergrass, Noam had his Top Tension. I was just earlier, the week prior, I was at the MIM Museum where Earl's banjo is for the Acoustic America exhibit.
Where was that?
The Phoenix MIM Musical Instrument Museum.
Oh, Earl's banjo was there?
Yeah. Are you?
Well, I presume.
Yes, I believe so. Do you find Do you find vintage banjos bring out some special magic, or is it kind of like a car where it's like, you know what, the new Deering outperforms in every way?
I think it depends. I was at IBMA when it was, well, it had been in its various locations, but this was in Owensboro, and whatever the hotel was there, and someone said, "Oh, you got to go down to room 332 or whatever the room was. Someone's got 6 pre-wars there lying on the bed, and you can go down there and check them out."
Mm-hmm.
And I did. And it's not every day you have 6 pre-wars sitting around, and so I tried each one of them, and I'd say half of them sounded great, sounded amazing, and then the other 3 were kind of like, eh. And I've played other pre-wars that were like, eh. But then it depends on the setup. There's a guy named Mike Munford. You know Mike, who he is?
I think his name has come up a few times, but I don't know him, no.
Yeah, he plays with Dirty Kitchen, and he's a great banjo player and the best setup player. He lives near Reading, Pennsylvania, and I make pilgrimages out there every maybe 5 or 6 months to have him, reset up my banjo, because they can sort of fall into not disrepair, but they just don't sound as good as they could. And he'll tweak it for 2 hours and get it sounding great. So you can have an instrument that on the face of it, you play it like Earl's banjo.
Yeah.
Didn't do much for me, but I'm sure if Mike Munford had his hands on it, he could get it sounding really good. There are all these tweaking things you can do.
There is like a dark arts to banjo setup that guitar players have it easy.
Yeah, they do. They're not some moving parts.
It's like truing a race bicycle wheel or something. I don't know, like banjo.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's infinitely more to play with a banjo. So there's the brackets, the tension on the head, the coordinating rods, the grooves in the bridge or the nut. I mean, there's so many aspects to it. You can take the neck off. So. But yeah.
We've been talking for this last 40 minutes about, Earl's importance as a banjo player, and you've discovering these tapes. What do you think a guitarist or a non-banjo player can learn from immersing themselves in the music of Earl Scruggs?
You can learn a lot about how to drive a band, which Earl could do. And you can learn a lot about syncopation. I was talking to Earl, we were friendly in his later years, and we were talking one time, and he said that he thought what he brought to the banjo was syncopation, which is where you accent notes that you don't expect to be accented. And as early as 1949, he recorded Farewell Blues with all these backward rolls, kind of 3/4 rhythm, and it just drives the band like crazy, and it's like so syncopated, notes falling where you don't expect them to fall. So, and he was really deep into that. So, I think anyone could learn from that sort of a thing. Another thing that he did that I teach when I do workshops, and I have this online banjo school, and I talk a lot about it there, is playing the syllables. And this is something where you're not like, less times people kind of play the melody, or they'll just sort of jam across a melody and not even really play the melody for a solo. And I first heard John Hartford talk about this, although I had already done it once before. I played on Alison Krauss's first album on half the tracks, and she sent me a recording, a cassette, which I wish I still had. Maybe I still have it somewhere hiding away, of the tunes she wanted me to play on. And I played. I started working up solos for the tunes, and rather than kind of playing the melody, I thought, I'll just try to phrase it the way she sang it. And by doing that, suddenly all these, my roles changed, my approach changed, and it was really kind of fun. Everything was fresh and new and exciting. By doing that, it was sort of a whole different perspective that I hadn't tried before. And that just occurred to me to try that. And then many years later, I'd hear John Hartford talk about this sort of thing, and I was giving this workshop at Elkins College in West Virginia, and he showed up there, and I asked him to sit in on my class, and I was saying, I want to show my class how you back up a fiddle tune. So he shows up with his fiddle and banjo, but instead talks more about the banjo, which was great. And he talks about how Earl would play the syllables of a tune rather than sort of playing the melody. He would play it really the way you would sing it. And he said, if you listen to the way Earl plays, I think it was Folsom Prison Blues on this album, American Made World Played, which came out in 1987. He takes 3 verse breaks. There are no vocals, it's just all instrumental, and Earl takes all the verse solos. And he said, you listen to it, and every verse is slightly different because he's singing the syllables for that verse. And I went home and listened to it later on, and he was right. Earl would pay so much attention to how to phrase the melody, the way he would actually sing it. You can almost hear the lyrics in the banjo solo. Anyway, that's something that anyone can take away from Earl's playing, because it applies. I've taught other instruments and say, okay, try playing the syllables of the tune, and suddenly they're, oh wow, that's hard. It seems like, well, that'd be easy, but it's hard to phrase it just the way you would sing it. So that's another thing, another takeaway from Earl's playing.
Did Earl invent that, or did that come from some precursor, Uncle Dave Macon, or something he heard as a child?
I don't know. I never asked him about that, where he got the idea. Well, the story goes that, and he tells this story, that he was playing something probably, going back and back. The first time I really got to hang out with Earl was on the phone, and I interviewed him for Banjo Newsletter because there was a best of Earl album coming out on Columbia, and they wanted me to interview him related to that. And the very first recording on there was the very first time he was in the studio with a tune called, now I'm forgetting the name of it. Anyway, it's a Bill Monroe recording. And for the solo, it's a blues. It's called Heavy Traffic Ahead. And he plays what later became known as Foggy Mountain Special. But Earl said, I based this on a tune called Step It Up and Go, which I loved when I was a kid. He called it Boogie Woogie style. And from what I understand, he was playing that around the house, and his mother walked by and said, Earl, play the melody. I can't hear that. And there's not really a melody to it. It's just sort of a blues riff. But he said, I can't hear the melody. And if I can't, and I hear you every day, no one else can. So I think from that point on, he started really playing the melody. I think that was the genesis for it. As I think about it now, I think that's where that came from, because his mother said, play the melody.
Yeah. Got to listen to your mother.
You got to. Yeah.
Yeah. What else is in store for you, Tony, for the year? You got this album coming out. You've got the follow-up next year. What else? A lot of touring, teaching? What are you doing?
I'm doing lots of touring and a couple of workshops. I'm doing Bela Fleck's workshop, the Blue Ridge Banjo Camp in Bard, North Carolina, which is absolutely wonderful. And a couple of other workshops and a bunch of festivals, and a lot of touring to promote the album. So that's really exciting. And sort of in the background, and this has been going on for a while, and I've only recorded 4 cuts. I'm putting music to Emily Dickinson poems. So that's another thing that sort of an ongoing thing.
How did that come about?
Out of the blue, I was invited to come up to Emily Dickinson's house, and someone was doing podcasts from there. He was trying to get people, creative people to perform in her bedroom, as I like to say. Which people, whenever I say that, people always go wrong. They go sideways with that. They always, their mind goes to the gutter.
Yeah, but that's really just where the good acoustics are.
That's where the good acoustics are. Well,
okay.
You wanted people to be, play. I mean, she wrote all of her poems in her bedroom, and so get authors to recite or musicians to play and whatever. And somehow they got my name, and I went up there. And my wife had a Fiat at the time, Fiat 500, which is a pretty small car. And as we're driving up there, and I have my banjo with me, I figured I should put some music to one of her poems. And I found a poem called "Frequently the Woods Are Pink." That's the first line. And I thought, that's a really great first line. So I'm going to put some music to this poem. So I'm in the Fiat in a very cramped state with the banjo neck sticking out of the sunroof and writing this tune, which I actually sang for this podcast. And they've never invited me back since, but so that's how this came about. And I figured, well, let me do this with some other folks. And I've done a tune with Abigail Washburn and just various other folks. And it's something, once this whole Earl thing is over with, and I've gotten friendly with Joyce Carol Oates from being at these Steve Martin parties. I got to know her, and she's really into banjo music and wonderful enough. And wrote a short story about based on Doc Boggs, if you're familiar with Doc Boggs.
Of course, yeah.
really crazy that she tuned into that. So,
Has that seen the light of day? Has that been published?
oh yeah, it's a book of short stories that she sent me. Yeah, so I don't remember the title of it, but yeah, she wrote this short story which is published. And anyway, I've asked her to recite this particular poem that she likes, and I'll put some banjo music behind it. So at some point I'll get that done. And in fact, I had a 75th birthday celebration at City Winery here in New York, and got Steve Martin to show up, and Bela showed up, and Noam, and just was a cast of thousands. And Joyce showed up for that also, and I got her to recite the poem, and I played behind it. So we've done it once, and I'll record it again. So it's been a really good year so far, is all I can say.
That's wonderful. Yeah. I mean, I'm floored that actually just sounds like a fun exercise for any musician. Find a poem and try to arrange it.
Yeah. Talk about playing the syllables, because I play the syllables of the poem. That's what I come up with. And it's a great exercise, and it's fun. And I love her poetry. And she was really out, she was writing from the 1840s till the 1880s or somewhere in there, maybe 50s. And things wouldn't always rhyme. And a lot of these poems, you're reading them and like, what is she talking about? It's not standard operating procedure for a poet in those days. And she played piano, and she improvised on the piano, because my wife and I went back up there this past fall, and we did a tour where we had this one person sort of giving us a guided tour. And he said that she would just sit at the piano and play tunes of the day, but also she would just improvise. Boy, would I like to have heard what that sounded like. And she had red hair, which I never realized. And her brother played banjo, who had a house just down the hill from her house. So anyway, she's a fascinating story.
All points lead back to banjo.
I didn't want to say that, but you seem pretty deep into the banjo. Doc Boggs, you're dropping Uncle Dave Macon's name, and so you get it.
I get it.
Yeah.
I mean, that was my first instrument, and I have about 5 feet over here the Masters of the 5-String Banjo book that I probably bought when I was 16 years old. So
that's worth a lot of money. You could sell that for $200 now.
Oh, I will.
$150. Went wildly out of print. You could retire on that. A phone book sized banjo book.
I mean, it was daunting when I was 16, and it's still daunting at 49. So yeah.
It's good bathroom reading, from what I understand. I haven't looked at it since it's been published. Well, and maybe I've looked at it a little bit, but anyway.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, there's one other thing. Well, also, I'm going to probably, hopefully, it looks like this will come to pass, do the Opry in like the third week of June, which is like, when I was a kid, I'd listen to the Opry up in Syracuse, New York, drive out with a friend in his VW Bug in January, trying to get clear channel 650 coming through. And now all these years later, I've actually done the Opry 4 times. And it's like, God, that's great that I got to do that.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's really amazing that I'm in that situation where I can do that. But what I wanted to say, which is also really mind-boggling, is that a year ago, I got a call from Mary Beth, I want to say Hartwick, I could look it up, who's she runs the Earl Scruggs Center in Shelby, North Carolina. And after Gary died, he was the last surviving direct member of Earl's family. And all of Earl's ephemera, his instruments, everything went to the Earl Scruggs Center. And Mary Beth called up and said, we were going through all this stuff. What he would do, there were boxes of strings. He would, starting in the mid-'60s, whenever he changed strings, he would put the dead strings back in the envelopes, the string envelopes, and then he would sign them and date them. And I was there in January, and we got to go, backstage, as it were, and see stuff that people don't see. And there were these boxes of string. I saw them, boxes of strings from like 1972 or something.
Wow.
Yeah. And then a whole box of string ties, and just, it's amazing stuff that they've got there. And then we went to Earl's house in Flint Hill nearby after that. And Earl and his brother Horace would play, when they were kids, they would play Sally Good, and they'd stand in front of their house playing Sally Good, and Horace on guitar and Earl, of course, on banjo. And they'd walk around opposite sides of the house and see if they were in time with each other when they got to the back. That was their metronome. That's how they worked on
Wow.
And then they'd walk, if they weren't in time, they'd walk back to the front. So we replicated that, me and my Uncle Dave's. We walked around opposite sides of the house.
How hard was it?
I was not in time. I'm sorry. My time sucks, obviously.
Well, you guys are still doing laps trying to nail it.
I know. Exactly. We did it about 30 times. We finally got it on the 30th try. Wow. But anyway, what I was going to, it was really fun. And it's a pretty ramshackle house, but what's really amazing is Mary Beth calls and says, we found this Mickey Mouse notebook, and it had, we opened it up. Mickey Mouse is on the cover. It's like a loose leaf notebook, and you open it up, and there are all these writings in Earl's handwriting about his life, which she thought might have been for the Earl Scruggs book, where there's a little bio thing in the front, and maybe he was asked to write things down for that, which I don't think any of it ended up in there. But it's in his own words, his childhood, how while he was so into playing the banjo that while he was plowing the fields, I mean, he grew up on a farm, they'd be there all day long farming, but he'd be doing finger rolls with the right hand on the plow handle and finger pattern, fingering chords on the left handle. And how he was frustrated when he was a kid because before he started playing with them, when he could play a tune for 5 minutes. And now he started playing with some local musicians, and he'd only get one solo in the tune, and that frustrated him. And then he said how the other thing, like people, when they were playing, these guys he was playing with didn't look very happy. They were very serious when they were playing. And you should be happy when you're playing. Mm. So you look at him in these videos, these Martha White videos, and he has this little slight smile. So he kind of looks out of the camera with a little bit of a smile. And I thought that was, man, all these years later, he still feels that way. It was really cool.
Yeah.
And talks about audition for Bill Monroe. It's like one thing another. He wrote that he gets depressed. I don't know if not exactly depressed when he's recording, but it depresses him because that's it. That's for all time. If there's a mistake on there, especially in the early days, he can hear him missing stuff by a fret.
Yeah.
So who cares? It's Earl killing it. But, and that went on the album that way. Whereas, he always wanted to change things and make it different each time. And there's a quote, which I love, where he says, you can't encore the past. If I see a bright light shining out there, I move toward it. Which I think is the greatest quote in the world. He
just came up with that? That's amazing.
Yeah, that's an Earl Scruggs quote. I found it. And I said, and I want to make sure this is accurate. And I found it it's even in the Earl Scruggs Center on their website. He really did say that.
Wow.
And, always trying new things. In 1962, Flatt and Scruggs did a CBS show, and King Curtis, the sax player, R&B sax player, was there. And Earl, I'd love to play with him sometime. And anyway, so there are these 60 pages of writings, which are really cool. And another thing that he told me, there's this, I think it's called Earl Scruggs Family and Friends. It's a movie they made with him and Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and the Byrds with Clarence White. And he said one time Ravi Shankar was coming to town, and they were supposed to record a jam session with him and Ravi Shankar, but they couldn't get a film crew. But Ravi Shankar came over anyway, and they started jamming. And afterward, Earl said, well, what would you like to have for lunch? And Ravi said, Kentucky Fried Chicken. So they got some Kentucky Fried Chicken and chowed down on tubs of slaw and wings and whatnot. So anyway, wish I'd been a fly on the wall for that. Anyway, so
wow.
Just endless stuff about Earl. Also, I went to his house one time, and we were just talking, and he said after they did the Beverly Hillbillies, Paul Henning, who was the producer of the show, called up and said, hey, Earl, we'd like to have you in a new show, Petticoat Junction. We'd like to have you be the engineer on Petticoat Junction. And Earl said, well, that'll break up Flatt and Scruggs. He said, no, we'll fly you back on the weekends from Hollywood so you can do the Opry and that sort of thing. But it never came to pass. But Earl could have been the engineer on Petticoat Junction.
Wow. And then we'd all be watching that more.
A whole lot more, exactly. Another great day for the banjo. If the engineer would play banjo, which they probably would have had him play some banjo too.
Sure. Well, I mean, this record is great. I think there's probably going to be more than one person listening to this going like, will these 200 recordings ever be reissued? I mean, is there any chance of that?
Well, I mean, It's funny because it doesn't belong to anyone. The Earl Scruggs Center doesn't have it. I got to get them a copy, by the way. And yeah, and I spoke to two of Gary's sons before I went ahead and did this, as well as John Hartford's daughter, to make sure they were okay with it. So I got through it. I mean, I could just put it out on YouTube, I suppose, but I'm not going to.
Sure.
And I'm not. Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't think it belongs to anyone. I don't know. It could just be out there. So I don't know. I would have to talk to them again. The boy, Gary's sons and John's daughter. But it's just this treasure trove. Not to mention all of John's fiddling for fiddlers. There's all this wonderful John Hartford fiddling on there.
Yeah.
Plus a few of those Tony Rice solos, which are great, needless to say.
Man, well, thank you so much for doing all this work.
Oh, you're welcome. So, I mean, it's just amazing that within the last 2 years, there's 200 tunes we've never heard him play, and this whole life story, not a whole life story, but, lots of musings and things about his life. There's this deep dive into Earl. I'm more in love with his music than I've ever been in my life, and his whole story. So and plus one last thing, and then I'll let you go. He was Obi-Wan. He had this Obi-Wan Kenobi aspect to him. I saw him at B.B. King's on 42nd Street in Manhattan a couple of times, but the second time, the band would all go back to the hotel right after the show, and Gary would hang out to get paid. And he'd say, "Why don't you hang out with Dad while I get paid?" And I'd hang out in this little dressing room with Earl, and we just chat for a while. And this particular time, this woman comes in kind of drunk and says, I'm here to get paid, and they're not paying me. And she's complaining, and she says, "Who are you?" And I identify myself. "And who are you?" "Oh, I'm Earl Scruggs." And, she has no idea who he is. "It's Earl Scruggs." Anyway, and she's kind of obnoxious. And after 3 or 4 minutes, I'm thinking, I've got to just stand up and get rid of her somehow, and say, "Oh, can I accompany you to where you're going to get paid?" And I'll talk, whatever I was going to say. And Earl just looks at her and says, "Nice to meet you." And she says, "Nice to meet you." And she walks out. It was sort of like, these are not the joys you're looking for. He just zapped her with an Obi-Wan Kenobi moment. And I was very impressed with that. "How do you do that, Earl?" And he got rid of her by just saying, "Nice to meet you." So anyway.
Between dropping the Kentucky Fried Chicken story and this, now I just feel like we need the biopic. Like, let's just cut to the chase, Hollywood.
Exactly. Well, there was one that was going to be done with Bill Monroe, with Maggie Gyllenhaal playing his.
I remember that. Yeah.
It was supposed to come to pass, and then they changed directors, and it fell apart. And they recorded a whole soundtrack for it. Michael Davis is on it, and T-Bone Burnett produced it. It's all there. So, time for Earl.
Yeah, clearly. I don't know who would play him, but I bet you've thought of that.
Well, I was thinking of Sylvester Stallone for his later. I don't know if that's appropriate or not.
Well, Tony, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And you're going to be on the road, so I'll probably see you at some festival or somewhere. But thank you.
Thank you. Where are you, by the way?
I'm in Seattle. I'm right down the street from Wintergrass.
Okay. I knew you were there. Okay, well, I'll make it back out there.
All right, please do.
Thank you, Jason, so much.
All right, that was my conversation with Tony Trischka. I hope you enjoyed it. I learned so much, and I knew a little bit about Earl Scruggs, but I've learned so much from this conversation. I hope you have as well. Drop me a line, podcast@fretboardjournal.com. Thank you, as always, for tuning in.